Thank you all for coming today and welcome to Once More Under the Clock, Remembering Kaufmanns. My name is Steve Jaron and I'm the president of the Jewish Genealogy Society of Pittsburgh. Our mission is to help people all over the world to reconnect with their Jewish ancestry in Western Pennsylvania, along with their ancestral homelands all over the world. I want to start by thanking everyone who made this program possible today, including the IT and events teams here at the Heinz History Center, our board members, Joel Bauman, Steffi Beersdorf, Evan Wolfson, and Deb Scheimer, and our member and volunteer, Lynn Jacobson. And of course, all of you for coming out in person today. We'll be hearing shortly from our authors, but first I wanted to provide a little background about our program today. In February of 2020, the Royal Jewish Archives approached us about forming a partnership to bring more high-quality Jewish genealogical programming to Pittsburgh. The partnership would use funds from the William M. Lowenstein Genealogical Education Fund to host a few large events each year. Almost immediately, the pandemic arrived, making large public events impossible. Instead, we shifted to an ambitious slate of monthly virtual programs. Over the past 3 years, the Jewish Genealogy Society and the Royal Jewish Archives have partnered on more than 30 programs with over 2,500 attendees from all over the world. These programs have featured some of the best Jewish genealogical speakers in the country, looking at everything from DNA to skills building to navigating European archives to Sephardic heritage and other programs that look into traditional overlooked corners of Jewish genealogy. Given the success of this initiative, we recently renewed our partnership through the end of 2024. Our goal for the next 2 years is to continue our monthly virtual programming while also building the local Jewish genealogical community through hybrid programs and other in-person and online events. Our event today is our first big program under this new phase of the partnership, and we're thankful to all of you for coming out today to learn about Kaufmann's department store and the family behind it. We'll begin today with a talk from Marilyn Pitts and Laura Mulch-Seiderman, authors of the new book, Kaufmanns. Marilyn Pitts is an award-winning journalist covering art, architecture, books, and history. She was a member of the news team that won the Pulitzer Prize for coverage of the Tree of Life shooting in 2018. She's won 5 Golden Quills, an Inland Press Association Award for investigative reporting, and a Matrix Award. A native of Indianapolis, she's lived in Pittsburgh since 1980. Laura Mulch-Seiderman is a journalist and web developer in Pittsburgh. She's won 7 Golden Quills and was a part of a team that won the Scripps Howard Edward J. Meeman Award in 2011. Originally from St. Louis, she has worked in journalism in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania. And without further ado, Laura and Marilyn.
Is anybody aware? Is anybody aware that the Kaufmanns were instrumental in building Point State Park or the Civic Arena? Well, they were. We're going to talk about that a little bit. Many years ago, there was another historian, Barbara Burston, giving a presentation, and she was talking about Irene Kaufmann. Has anybody heard the name Irene Kaufmann? Yes. Maybe if you're like me, you pictured Irene Kaufmann as an older lady who gave some money and therefore got her name on a building. But Barbara Burston said that actually Irene Kaufmann killed herself when she was 19. And when she said this to a room full of people to whom she was giving this presentation, everybody gasped. And then she said, 10 years later, Irene Kaufmann's mother threw herself out the window of the Ritz-Carlton in New York City. And again, the whole room gasped. So at that point, it was kind of clear that people in Pittsburgh knew the name Kaufmanns, but they didn't know much about the Kaufmanns. So many years later, Mary Lynn and I were working at the Post-Gazette together, and Kaufmann's was going to close. By that time, they were Macy's. And we worked together. Mary Lynn was the writer. She read the story. I was the web developer. We collaborated on the research. And when the website came out, boom, all of a sudden we were getting phone calls. comments were appearing on the website. We looked at what they call the analytics, how many people were reading the web page, reading the site. And that day that it came out, more people were reading the story about Kaufmann's than were reading the story about the Pittsburgh Steelers. And when we saw that, we knew we were on to something. So without further ado, we'll talk a little bit about the Kaufmanns.
So the Kaufmann family came from Germany, from a town called Fernheim, which translated from the German means fern home. And they were dealers in cattle and horses. And they faced their share of anti-Semitism at one point. They had to bury their valuables in their yard. And in 1868, young Jacob Kaufmann, age 19, immigrated here to Pittsburgh, possibly because he was aware that there was an established Jewish community here. And he began peddling all over southwestern Pennsylvania on foot, selling all manner of things having to do with sewing, needle, thread, thimble, laces, bobbins, etc. And he did this for several years. Then he had enough money to bring over his brother, Isaac. Together, they peddled. And then they finally got a horse-drawn wagon. And then in 1871, they took all the money they had in the world, which was about $2,000, and opened a store on the south side of Pittsburgh, what was then known as Birmingham. Then later on, by the late 1870s, they were in downtown Pittsburgh. This is a picture here of Jacob, probably about the 1880s, I would say. He's very successful at this point, and he has, if you just look here,
Red one.
yeah,
Yeah.
not
Here, let me
working.
try.
Yeah. If you look at the bottom here, you can see he has a carnation in his lapel. He loved going to see the forest every day so that he could have a fresh carnation in his lapel, and he liked to wear diamond-studded cufflinks.
So eventually there were four brothers. These are the four brothers. We'll point them out. Well,
Here, I'll put it.
yeah, okay.
So,
All right. The first one is Jacob. We mentioned him, and he's on the far left there. And then his wife sitting in front of him is Augusta. And you might notice that she looks like she's a pretty tough lady. We'll get into her later. The next one is Henry and his wife, Teresa, and then Morris and his wife, Betty. And the last one is Isaac and his wife, Emma. Has anybody ever heard of Emma Kaufmann Camp? Yes, that is Emma Kaufmann.
So this is an early iteration of the Kaufmann's building. You can see it has not taken up the entire block yet. But if you look on the very top left-hand corner of the building, you'll see that there is a goddess of liberty on the building. This is something that the Kaufmanns had installed on the building, and it was the job of one of the employees to climb up and make sure that it was lit every evening. It was lit by gas, and you could see it from, far off in the distance. The Kaufmanns took, they did not take advantage, or they did not take for granted the fact that this was the land of liberty for them, that they could practice their religion, that they could operate a business, and that they were living in the land of opportunity.
So as time went by, the Kaufmanns had really jumped on this wave of a new kind of merchandising called department stores, and they had come in at exactly the right time, and they became quite wealthy. But they were getting older, and the question kind of came up, well, who's going to take over this store once we retire? Now, we mentioned there are four brothers. Jacob, the oldest brother who we've been talking about, had 5 sons. Any one of whom could have taken over the store and done very well with it. However, the Ford brothers had a contract that was very common at the time called a tontine. And under this contract, if one brother died, the other brothers had to buy out his share. And that's what happened. Jacob was the oldest brother. He died. The other three brothers bought out his share. And you remember Augusta, that tough looking lady from the other slide, a couple slides back? She said, "This is not right. You are shortchanging us. My husband was worth more than that." And she sued them. So, and what's more, she and her sons, and about half the staff of Kaufmann's, which by that time were cousins, distant and more close cousins, all left. They built their own department store 2 blocks down the road on Smithfield. Yep. Smithfield Street, and started their own department store called Kaufmann and Bear. Later, Impulse bought it. That was the origin of Impulse in downtown Kaufmann and downtown Pittsburgh. So Isaac and Henry, you can see, just have one child apiece, and they are daughters. And this being the late 1800s, you don't leave your business to a woman, God only knows what would happen. So Morris had 2 sons, and they were grooming the oldest son, Edgar, to take over the business. And he married Lillian, his first cousin.
Okay. So, I'd like you to look closely at these 2 portraits of Irene Kaufmann. We want to just sort of bring her story to a close. On the left, you can see this lovely Gilded Age portrait of her with her hands clasped in front of her and a beautiful gown and the Gibson girl hairdo. On the right, you can see that a very different view of her. She is astride her horse. She has a very determined look on her face. She was a very headstrong, popular, spirited young woman who had a lot of friends. She liked to go shopping, and she liked to drive the family car. Unfortunately, the research by Barbara Burston indicated that the reason she committed suicide was because her parents did not want her to marry the family chauffeur. Yeah. So after her death, her parents, Henry and Charles Kaufmann, named the Irene Kaufmann settlement in her memory. The Irene Kaufmann settlement was an important landmark in the Hill District here in Pittsburgh. Generations of immigrants came there to learn how to speak English, how to study for their citizenship test. They also had the opportunity to compete in sports, such as swimming and basketball. They put on theatrical productions. There were painting classes taught by the famous Samuel Rosenberg, who later went on to become Andy Warhol's teacher at Carnegie Mellon. The Irene Kaufmann settlement was a really important place for immigrants from all over the world here in Pittsburgh.
So we mentioned that Edgar married his first cousin Lillian, and you might be asking yourself, well, isn't that illegal? And it was in Pennsylvania, but not in New York. So they went to New York to the very fancy Regis Hotel to get married. They took a special train up, but they were not the first cousins in the family to get married. In fact, this wasn't uncommon among but families in general, especially Jewish families in Europe, which might have been from smaller regions and might have been limited in who they could marry. Lillian's mother, Emma Kaufmann, was the first cousin to her father, Isaac. So marrying your first cousin was a family affair.
Now, Lillian Kaufmann here, this is a picture of her as a young woman, was brought up to be a philanthropist. Her father, Isaac, who you just saw in the previous picture, was very generous here in the community. She was a woman who really evolved over time. She was raised in the Gilded Age, but she became a businesswoman. She was the creator and the force behind the Von Dome at Kaufmann's. It originally began in the 1930s. Lillian wanted to find a way for local seamstresses and jewelry makers to have work. So they would execute her designs and she sold them in the Vendôme. Later on, she began taking trips to Paris and buying designer clothing, antiques, Swarovski crystals, Steuben glass. So she became a prominent businesswoman here in Pittsburgh. She also was a very dedicated volunteer at Mercy Hospital and at Montefiore Hospital. Montefiore Hospital, you know, was the first Jewish hospital here in Pittsburgh. And she served as the leader of its board of directors for 10 years, something no other woman has done.
And we did research and we kind of would come to conclusions about the different people we researched. What did you end up thinking about Lillian?
I think that Lillian Kaufmann is actually probably one of the most interesting people in the family because she really evolved over time, not only into a businesswoman, but into a civic leader. She was a volunteer. She really cared passionately about her community. I think that's really admirable.
So this is a picture of Edgar, and you can tell he's not bad looking. He supposedly had a scar on his cheek from a sword fight in Germany. Nobody's been able to pin that down exactly, but he was really groomed to be the new leader of Kaufmann's. He went to school at Shadyside Academy, the prep school here. He went to Yale for a year. He apprenticed at department stores in Europe, in Paris, and in Germany. And he spent the year in Connellsville at a store there. And eventually he worked at every department in Kaufmann's. He loved technology. He loved being around people. And he was very attractive to women.
Okay. This is the, Edward Kaufmann was happiest when he was building something, whether it was a store or a house. And this is the first house that he and Lillian built. It's called La Tourelle. It stands today out in the O'Hara Fox Chapel area on La Tourelle Lane near Pasadena Drive. It's called La Tourelle for the tower, which you see here in the picture. It was designed for them by Benno Jansen, who was a highly sought after architect by Pittsburgh's high society. It also had stables, and it had a very large sink where you could wash your riding boots when you came in from the stables. It's notable also because it had two famous house guests. In the 1930s, Albert Einstein came to Pittsburgh to visit, and Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann served as his translators because they were both fluent in German. And so Albert Einstein stayed here at La Tourelle. The other famous house guest was Frank Lloyd Wright, who sat in the living room of this house designing plans for falling water.
Does anybody remember the Civic Arena? Stupid question. This is a rare photo of the Civic Arena with its roof fully retracted. The Civic Light Orchestra was a light opera company modeled on St. Louis's light opera company, which operated in the summertime in an outdoor theater. And Edgar bankrolled it in its early seasons, but they had a problem. They didn't have anywhere to perform. They were performing at Pitt Stadium. And as you know, what happens in June in Pittsburgh? It rains. So if there were outdoor presentations, plays in Pittsburgh in June, a lot of times they would get rained out, and they couldn't extend the season into August because then the football team at Pitt would start to use the stadium. So they needed their own place. And it was Edgar's idea that the Civic Arena be built with that round retractable roof. He said it should be like a mother hen spreading her wings over her chicks. So he contributed $1 million toward the construction of the Civic Arena. the problem with that was once they retracted the roof, it became very, very windy. Carol Burnett was performing in the Civic Arena the first time they retracted the roof, and she said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the sky." And then the wind began to blow, and she said, "Can I have a coat, please?" And then she said, how do you shut this thing?" So it did not turn out to be a good idea. Edgar loved Pittsburgh. He worked as a $1 a year man for the government, just basically contributing his services during World War II for the Price administration. During the Great Depression, he proposed a Pittsburgh plan, which was some merchants contributing a percentage of their revenue toward a fund which would pay people to work on roads projects and other civic projects. They proposed it to Washington, but it wasn't enough to get the country out of the Depression.
So this is Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann's only child. His name was Edgar Kaufmann Jr. He initially wanted to be a painter, and early in his life, he studied painting in various capitals of Europe. Then he came back to Pittsburgh in the early 1930s after Hitler had come to power in Germany. And a friend of his gave him a copy of Frank Lloyd Wright's autobiography. So Edgar Kaufmann decided he wanted to go to Taliesin in Spring Green, Wisconsin, to study architecture, and he did. While he was there, his parents came to visit, and they were taken with the charismatic Frank Lloyd Wright and commissioned him to build falling water. Edgar did not stay long at Taliesin because as the only child of a wealthy couple, he was accustomed to having his underwear ironed and servants picking up after him regularly. Life at Taliesin was not anything like that. Life at Taliesin was about getting up in the morning and going out and planting vegetables and weeding the garden and chopping wood and just basically working hard the livelong day. So Edgar wound up becoming a curator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York, where he organized exhibitions of good design. He lived, I would say, the bulk of his life in New York, and he also taught architecture at Columbia University. The best gift he gave Western Pennsylvania was deeding falling water to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy, which holds it in trust and which maintains it.
So one of the wonderful things that Edgar and Lillian did as a couple was to redesign or renovate Kaufmann's first floor downtown. Originally, Kaufmann's was built like most Victorian department stores, which is to say sort of dark, full of dark, heavy furniture made of dark wood, very fancy, carved, dimly lighted. The walls would be painted like gray or some other color. And they wanted something much more modern, which in 1930 was Art Deco. They wanted an Art Deco palace, and they said that they would spare no expense, even though the market had crashed 6 months earlier and people were destitute. They did not spare any expense. They imported black Carrara marble pillars, which you can see, these are not trees. Well, the black vertical lines are their pillars, which have the names of the departments on them. They have blonde wood cabinets, and they commissioned an artist named Boardman Robinson to paint a series of murals called The History of Commerce, which were on the walls, and they unveiled to much fanfare in 1930. They had silver wrought iron fixtures. One second. And basically, they just made it into an Art Deco palace, very modern, which was their goal.
So after the triumph of the opening of the remodeled store in 1930, their next building project was the creation of flowing water with Frank Lloyd Wright. The house built over Bear Run waterfall, the stream. Once the house was opened in 1937, it landed Frank Lloyd Wright on the cover of Time magazine. It was featured in many architectural publications. And this was a very important refuge for Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann. Pilots who flew over Pittsburgh in the 1930s said that it looked like a big black ball of ink. And so you can imagine how happy Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann were to drive to this beautiful place in the Laurel Highlands, hear the sound of water, hike in the woods, and just generally get away from the smog and the dirt of Pittsburgh. This was also a place where they invited people like Diego Rivera, the famous Mexican muralist, and his wife, Frida Kahlo, to be house guests. Mrs. Kaufmann called this house leaking water because the roof leaked regularly, and it's a common problem with Frank Lloyd Wright buildings. But it was an important refuge for them, and they invited many of their close friends here, including H.J. Hines II, who was a very close friend of Edgar Kaufmann.
So this is a picture of Lillian and Edgar as the power couple. We mentioned that Lillian ran this boutique called the Bon Dome, and she ran it her way. Her secretary would bring her a sheet of papers, and Mrs. Kaufmann would say, "What's that?" And her secretary would say, "Well, that's your budget, Mrs. Kaufmann." And Mrs. Kaufmann would take that budget, rip it up, and throw it in the trash. She went through a lot of secretaries that way. She became very successful. And given the time period, you would think that perhaps maybe her husband might not have been supportive. After all, she was in the same field as he was, the same realm. She's running a store, and she's every bit as successful as he is. But that wasn't the case. Edgar was very proud of her, and he was very supportive of her.
He also supported this woman. And her name was Billy Scheibel. To the readers of Pittsburgh newspapers, she was known as public hostess #1. That meant that she ran a house of prostitution. And it was a house of prostitution that was frequented by Edgar Kaufmann, as well as many other important civic leaders in Pittsburgh. Eventually, Mrs. Scheibel moved her house of prostitution to New York.
It was she the only woman that he was with?
No. Edgar Kaufmann's own cook, Elsie Henderson, said that Edgar Kaufmann was, quote, the playboy of the Western world. Edgar had many women, paid and bought.
In a more friendly, family-friendly sense, he also really loved technology. We were talking about that earlier. In 1909, the big thing was airplanes, and there was only one airplane that was for sale at that time. That was the Curtiss biplane, and he had it hung from the ceiling of Kaufmann's first floor. The next year, he had a replica of the Wright brothers airplane with its engine running and its propellers turning, hanging from the first floor ceiling. During World War II, they had the Blitz buggy on display in the store, which we know as the Jeep. It was made in Butler, PA, just north of here. And in 1912, he displayed this car, which was the world's fastest car at the time, called the Mercedes Blitzen II. After World War II, Pittsburgh had a lot of steel on its hands, and the question was, what do we do with all this steel? One answer was, well, why don't we make houses completely of steel? And Kaufmann's displayed these steel air houses on the roof of the store, complete with a car in the carport and a swimming pool.
Now, most of us who go shopping know that when you go into a store and you look at something you might buy, you check the price. But in the early days of the department stores, around the 1870s, that was not the case. If you went in and said, I'd like to see this shawl, and they would bring it out for you, the clerk would then decide, based on how well or how poorly you were dressed, what you might be able to afford to pay for that shawl. The Kaufmann brothers didn't think this was very good. They decided that they would follow the lead of some New York retailers. They said, one price for all. And they started putting price tags on their merchandise. So that was an early innovation, and they touted the fact that they had one price for all and high quality products regularly in their newspaper ads.
One of the really interesting things that Edgar and Lillian did as a couple for the store was they held what amounted to a World's Fair inside the store in 1926. They wanted people to see how much craftsmanship went into the products that they were going to buy at Kaufmann's. So they brought in all kinds of craftspeople and displayed them around the store. This included some Filipino women working in a native hut. They had Beethoven's piano, they had Lalique glass, they had rug weaving, they had an electronic transmission of photographs, which sounded to us a lot like a fax machine. This is 1926. And they had their candy department make an exact replica of the Fort Pitt blockhouse, entirely of chocolate and weighing 200 pounds. And they advertised all this in very, very florid language, which was typical of the Kaufmanns at the time. They said brasses from Babel, Baghdad, and embroidered banners celebrating the might of Manchu emperors will be seen at this wonderful exposition in 1926.
So around 1946, Edgar Kaufmann was starting to spend more time in Palm Springs, California, where he had built a house that was designed by Richard Northrup. And he had a decision to make. He could turn over the leadership of the store either to the gentleman in this photograph, who's on the right here, I.D. Wolf. I.D. Wolf was his brother-in-law, and I.D. Wolf was a fourth in retailing. He was an innovative retailer, and whenever Edgar wasn't around, I.D. ran the store. The woman to his right is Lillian Kaufmann, Edgar Kaufmann's wife. So Edgar could have turned over leadership of the store to I.D. Wolf or his loyal younger brother, Oliver Wolf, who was also a store executive. But it was a difficult choice for him, so he decided instead to sell the store to Macy's. So Macy's bought Kaufmann's in 1946, but the Kaufmann name remained, and Edgar retained his title as president of Kaufmann's until his death in 1955. Lillian died in 1952, and I.D. Wolf died in the 1950s as well. So by the 1960s, there was one family member left working at Kaufmann's, and that was I.D. Wolf's son, John Wolf, who learned one day that someone had been promoted over him, and he decided that it was high time that he leave Kaufmann's and start his own business. He did. He was very successful. And he was also a very generous philanthropist to the Jewish Community Center here in Pittsburgh. There's a fitness center with the Wolf family name on it at the JCC.
So after the family died out, the store became owned by a corporate entity, and we're going to skip over the history of what happened to the store in the decades that followed. But we are going to talk a little bit about some beloved traditions in the store. One was the Christmas windows. And here you can see a young admirer of one of the windows with his very own camera. And here is a window designer designing the windows for the 2013 theme, which was the magic of Christmas. You'll note that he's working with a black curtain behind him, and that's because they built the windows and just blocked them off from public view. And then on light up night at an arranged signal, which might be a young woman dressed as a fairy tapping her wand on the window or some light signal, all the curtains would fall and the crowds would surge forward. The window designer said you would know when you had made a good window when the next morning there were nose prints and handprints all over them. And here's another very young set of admirers of a set of Christmas windows.
The clock, of course, looms large in everyone's memories of Kaufmann's. And if you'll notice here in this particular picture, on the left here, this man looks almost as if he's a figure of the clock, but he's actually polishing the brass on the clock. The clock was, of course, restored. It was taken apart and cleaned and then brought back. It's been an important meeting place for generations of Pittsburghers. And here are some more contemporary views of it. The one on the left is more recent. The one on the right, if you look very, very carefully here, you can see that a woman has climbed up on the clock, and so has this gentleman here. It's 1971, and these people are celebrating the fact that the Pittsburgh Pirates have won the World Series, which is not going to happen anytime soon.
And this is what Kaufmann's building looks like today. There's still more retail in this spot than any other spot downtown. Although no big department stores anymore. There's the building actually contains more than just the Target here. It contains a hotel, the Even Hotel, and some high-end apartments and a waffle and coffee shop. And they're renovating part of it to be a Burlington Coat Factory. But the Target, when you go through the doors of this Target, if you look on either side of the entry, you will see these Art Deco silver panels, and there will be no plaque telling you what they are, but they are the remains of the 1930 renovation.
We're going to close with this picture of Edgar Kaufmann. This is a picture of him in his office at Kaufmann's department store. And he is doing what he loved to do, leaning over a set of blueprints and envisioning the building. The office that you're looking at was designed out of cypress veneer for Edgar Kaufmann by Frank Lloyd Wright. We tend to associate Edgar with, of course, the store and Falling Water, but he was much more than a merchant prince and a master builder. He was an important civic leader. He cared passionately about promoting the city of Pittsburgh, putting it in its best light. Many of you probably have that lovely Stephen Laurent book at home. It's Pittsburgh, the Story of the City. It was Edgar Kaufmann who actually commissioned that book and made sure that it came to publication. And he also created Falling Water. As you know, when people come to Western Pennsylvania, the two top destinations on our list are Falling Water and the Andy Warhol Museum, in addition, of course, to the Heinz History Center. But we can thank Edgar Kaufmann for building Falling Water because it brings more people to Western Pennsylvania every year, especially now that Falling Water is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. He also was great at getting people to aspire and to appreciate art as well as commerce. With that, we'll be happy to take questions.
Great.
Thank you, Mary Lynn and Laura. So this is a hybrid program. So this is a hybrid program, and in order to get the camera set up for the panel discussion, we need to take about a 5-minute break. So while the break is going, we've got a selection of images from the Kaufmann department store archives here that are mostly some of the windows you may remember. So just sit tight for a few minutes, and then we'll reconvene on the other side of the stage in a few minutes.
Thanks. Oh, Eric, Lindsay, and the Jewish Genealogical Society for organizing this program. And during the 5-minute break, if you have a chance, the display cases behind you have wonderful pieces of Kaufmann's memorabilia that Eric and his staff put together, and they're really worth looking at.
I was beating myself up because
All right, we're gonna get started. If everybody would come back to their seats, please.
I'm not trying to.
So since Kaufmann's, or what became Kaufmann's Macy's closed, there have been 3 books published locally about the store, and we're fortunate today to have all of the authors of those books available to talk a little bit about their process and the writing of those books and their personal reflections on the store. So we've already introduced the first 2, but I'd like to introduce the other 2 authors as well. Melanie Lynn Gutowski is a historian and museum educator based here in the greater Pittsburgh area. She's the author of the pictorial histories Pittsburgh Mansions and Kaufmann's Department Store, both from Arcadia Publishing. A self-professed Gilded Age geek, Melanie is continually fascinated by American and European history and culture from 1865 to 1920, especially robber barons, historic homes, and decorative arts. Melanie holds a master's degree in professional writing from Chatham University and a Bachelor of Arts in French and History of Art and Architecture from the University of Pittsburgh. Melanie, would you raise your hand just so that everybody knows who you are? And then we have Letitia Savage, who published her first article while she was still in college. It was a chapter for an engineering book on the effect of oil spills on marine organisms. She continued freelance magazine writing while working as an environmental consultant, primarily on hazardous waste cleanups for the military and US EPA. In addition to contributing environmental and gardening articles to Country Journal, she wrote about horse training and horse keeping for many national horse publications, including the Chronicle of the Horse and Horse Illustrated. After years of magazine writing, Letitia published her first book on Kaufmann's Department Store in Pittsburgh for Arcadia Press in 2016. She and her husband live in a pre-Civil War farmhouse that they restored in Swickley, PA. So when Mary Lynn and Laura were starting their talk today, they mentioned how they sort of came to realize that there was a lot about the Kaufmanns that Pittsburghers didn't know. I was wondering, Letty and Melanie, if you could just talk a little bit about how you got interested in this subject and came to write books about it.
And I'll start. So my parents grew up in Pittsburgh. My mother was a very good department store shopper from her youth. And when we relocated to Pittsburgh when I was a teenager, she introduced us into the downtown circuit of shopping, which always included lunch at TikTok. And then when Kaufmann's moved out to the suburbs, we had the little suburban Kaufmann. So we were kind of introduced to Pittsburgh shopping through her experience, having shopped the store, probably 30s, 40s. And it just became part of the fun day downtown back in the days when retail shopping was fun. And I guess for the book, I was watching PA Books, which is a fantastic show on PA cable that covers books published by Pennsylvania writers. And there was a man being interviewed about one of the stores in New Jersey that had branches in Philadelphia. And he looked right at the camera and he said, "There were so many great department stores in Pittsburgh. I don't know why nobody's written about them, especially Kaufmann's." And I thought, oh, now that's interesting. That would make a good first book attempt. And Arcadia agreed.
And Melanie, what about you?
Well, I was the last bride in my family to register at Kaufmann's. So that, it's a sort of a special thing to me. And unfortunately for me, in my guests, I got married just at that weird time when the name switchover was happening between Kaufmann's and Macy's. So literally I registered at Kaufmann's. I got married. I went on my honeymoon. By the time I got back from my honeymoon, between my wedding and honeymoon, it was no longer Kaufmann's. It was Macy's. And after we got home, it was a few weeks after the wedding, we get this package in the mail and a letter with it. The letter was from Macy's and it basically said, we're so sorry for making your registry a complete and utter mess. Because of course, in the switch, things were getting discontinued, you'd register for something and then it would be, basically marked down and you may find it in the store, you might not find it in the store. So, people were really frustrated, couldn't find things and everything. And I guess by way of, atonement, they sent me this little crystal heart-shaped candy dish, which it's pretty much useless. I've never actually used it. It's still in the box. I will donate it someday. I have the letter and all of that stuff. But I just thought that was very funny. They also sent me an email survey afterward, basically asking if they had been Macy's at the time I was registering, would I still have registered with them? And I said, no. I had, as Eric said before, I had written another book in 2013 about historic mansions in the Pittsburgh area. And it was actually one of my readers of that book who came to me about Kaufmann's. She emailed me and was very upset because the news had just come out that Macy's was closing the flagship store. And she said, I'm just so sad about this. I guess she had worked in the store at one point. And she said, why isn't anybody writing about this? So at the time, Letty was already writing her book, but I didn't know that. So there still wasn't any book that you could just walk in and pick up off the shelf of the bookstore and read about Kaufmann's. So, I emailed my editor at Arcadia and said, maybe this might be a good idea. But actually, I tried to get the woman to write it first. I said, well, I'm happy to put you in touch with my editors if that's something that you are, want to explore with them. And she said, no, I want you to write it. So at the time I was actually expecting my second child, and that was the furthest thing from my mind was, getting back into writing another book. So I thought about it for a while, but in the immediate, aftermath of this idea being dropped on me, I thought, well, the store is closing. I might want to go take some pictures. If I do write a book, it would be nice to have a few pictures of kind of the last days to use if I do this. So I went downtown and took a bunch of photos. But yeah, it was somebody else said, you should write this book. And so I did.
This question is a little bit self-serving, but not entirely. We obviously hold the Kaufmann's department store archives here at the Heinz History Center. I was just wondering if all of you could talk a little bit about the process of researching this book, which is bigger than just the materials we have here. There's materials in other places. I don't know that people always get a sense of what it looks like to go through a collection of materials. And if you could just talk a little bit about the kinds of where you looked for records and what you found and what the process of looking at those records is like. If you want to start, Mary Lynn, we can go the other direction.
First of all, it's a very time-consuming effort to write a book. The Heinz History Center has one of the loveliest research rooms I've ever been in. It's up on the 7th floor, the 6th floor, I guess. Laura and I were able to go in and make appointments with the archivists and see the various files associated with the store, with the Edgar Kaufmann Charitable Foundation, some of the early Kaufmann's catalogs, photographs of Christmas windows, correspondence. There was even a leather-bound ledger that showed something that would have been probably written on by the founders of the store, sort of tracking inventory for the store. So it's a big picture that you're getting. And you don't just come here. Laura and I made, I'd say, half a dozen trips to Falling Water to look through the archives there, to look at letters that had been exchanged between Edgar and Lillian Kaufmann and their son. Also to look at architectural renderings. And then of course there were interviews that we conducted with people who live here in Pittsburgh and elsewhere to learn more about how the store operated. We talked with many window designers, window display designers, which is an art all unto itself. And we also interviewed former store employees. It was, it was a considerable effort. I can say that coming here to do research is always a pleasure. The staff here is top-notch, and all of the archives are well organized. They're finding aids, so that if you want to come and look at something very specific, all you have to do is email the archive staff and ask if there's a time between Wednesday and Saturday that you could come in and do research. It's really fun.
My research process was slightly different because mine is pictorial history. So, really tried to not talk about things that I can't show in that type of a book. So primarily my task was to find images of all the things that I wanted to make sure that I included. And of course, the available materials that you can simply peruse online has expanded considerably since I believe 2015 when I was doing my research. So it was a very analog process still. I remember going through every single issue of the store employee newsletter that was available upstairs. Of course, the librarian, who I believe I learned today she's no longer here, Mary Jones, she was excellent to work with. Everybody was very helpful, and I do have to give a shout out to all the volunteers that work in the library and archives that helped with scanning all of the images that I needed for my book. I literally couldn't have done it without them. One of my major challenges with the research was to find the exact right photo for the cover of the book, because I knew it had to have the clock. If it didn't have the clock, everyone would be very upset. And I would have no end of questions about, well, why isn't the clock in the picture? And the problem with that is to find something that is sufficiently old, because the publisher doesn't want anything that's, less than 20 years old. The problem is the orientation of Kaufmann's itself. When people typically stand on Smithfield Street and they take a picture and the clock is at the right of the photo. If they stand on Fifth Avenue, the clock is at the left. And the problem with that is that the way that the publisher orients the photograph, it wraps around to the back cover. So the clock can't be on the left because it will be on the back cover. And most of the time when it was on the right, it would be up too high and it would get covered up by the sort of chyron that they put the titles of all the books in. So it was literally down to the wire. I was way behind deadline on giving them a cover photograph because we just couldn't find the right one. And I had found one from the 80s and they said, well, that's not really old enough. I said, well, okay, I'll try to find something else. Literally going through every possible photograph, finally found a slide. I'm holding it up to the lamp trying to see this thing, if this is going to work. And I looked and it was from, I think, 1971 or 72. Springtime, it's a great picture. People are crossing the street and there's the clock. And it wasn't going to get covered up by anything. And I thought, this is it. But I mean, it was literally down to the wire of delivering this manuscript. And of course, your cover art is due long before the manuscript actually is. So that was a very painstaking process to make sure that people in Pittsburgh buying this book would be happy with the cover of it. Because I could imagine, everybody has such strong feelings and such ownership over their Kaufmann's memories that they might decide, I'm not going to buy that book because it doesn't have the clock on the cover. So that was probably one of my biggest challenges image-wise.
So I guess I do more of a hybrid process, which is start with the words. And I would also say the archive is wonderful to work in. The only other archive that I spent that much time in was in Germany, going through World War II history. So it was very nice to be able to do it in English, have helpers. That was the other thing I rounded up. My husband helped me do the research for the Kaufmann's book and for the Horns book that we did as a second book number 2. Kaufmann's was a whole lot fewer boxes of stuff. But we would routinely come in Saturday morning, park, go upstairs, and sit with boxes. I was on one box, he was on another box until we got through all of the boxes of documents. And then you have the images. So for me, was more starting with the words and finding some really unique things, and then finding, sadly, we didn't have any images of those specific things, but there's creativity in taking the images you do have and backfitting them in to tell the story. So that if somebody doesn't want to read too much text, they can look at a photo and they can still get some of the story in the captions. So we use the archives here, and then the other big archive that was just tremendously valuable was the online Post-Gazette archive, which doesn't just capture Post-Gazette, but captures all of the newspapers that the Post-Gazette acquired. And I think their earliest documents are like 1798. So I was able to pull up all of the Kaufmann's, there's newspaper articles covering Kaufmann's, all of the Kaufmann's ads. And then there are pieces in there that didn't appear in the archives because the archives capture what people donate. So if you've worked for a Pittsburgh company or a Pittsburgh person and you have stuff at home, consider donating it to the archives, because some of the most compelling things that then historians find are family remembrances. I would find correspondence, people writing into the store, their memories, 90-year-old shoppers going, oh, I remember when, or I remember dealing with this person. Employee reminiscences, really, really valuable. But one of the things that I found in the newspaper that I couldn't find a picture of was a marketing ploy. The Kaufmanns were brilliant at marketing. And I think this was gosh, his name's right out of my head. Big illusionist, Houdini. Houdini came to Pittsburgh, and Kaufmann's arranged to have Houdini nailed into a crate, I think either in the store or one of their windows. And then he would escape from the crate. And I thought, what a great story. I didn't see anything that I recall in the archives, but there were no photos. So we included it in text, but it would have been nice to have a photo. So that was the Post-Gazette archives are just fantastic. And it's not that expensive to join for, I think it's a monthly fee or a yearly fee.
It's $7.99, I think.
A
If
month.
you just want to do a month.
Yeah, and
You
it
need a
was
free
just,
trial,
yeah, it was fantastic. And then the other piece is there's a really strong national interest in department stores. So there are websites out there of department store history. And in the Kaufmann's piece, there were people from all around the country logging in and leaving their Kaufmann's memoirs of what they remembered about shopping at the store. And I think it's called the Department Store. Department Store is in.
Yes.
Store museum.
Yeah, and it had some really great stuff.
I should also add, piggybacking on what Letty just said, there is a lot of interest in this also on Facebook. There's a fantastic Facebook group called the Golden Age of the Department Store. So if you're interested in, the history of department stores, just the experience of shopping in old department stores, that's a really great group to join. Of course, they do talk about Kaufmann's. They talk about a lot of other stores also, but people share things that they've found, they come across a hat box in a thrift store or something like that, and they're sharing there. So it's really nice to have a community of people who are all interested in that same sort of little niche topic.
And would like a time machine so you could go back and shop.
Yes, yeah.
There's also, just picking up on what Letitia and Melanie have said, there's also Historic Pittsburgh, which is a website that was developed by the University of Pittsburgh Archive Service Center. And there are a lot of wonderful references and resources on that website. It's just called Historic Pittsburgh. .org. So if you're looking for images of Pittsburgh, that's a good resource.
So I have one more question and then we'll take questions from the audience. If you could just all reflect on why you think that the department stores in general and Kaufmann's in particular seems to hold such a fascination for Pittsburghers and such a deep and emotional place for so many people in the city. Go for it. Yeah.
I think because people associate stores with such good memories. So you had the Vendome, which I have a box at home and I think it has the linens in it that were bought at the Vendome. That was such a big deal to be able to go in there and be exposed to that kind of shopping. My aunt had a centerpiece and everybody was reminded that I think it was either a wedding gift or she worked and she shopped for herself at Vendome and bought it for herself, which was a very big thing. There were not a lot of women having careers and buying things for themselves at the high-end store instead of waiting for a man to buy it for her. The wedding registries. So many people would go, oh, I remember the bridal department picking my wedding dress, special meals in the restaurant. So many kids being taken downtown by parents to look in the window and see Santa. That was like a huge, almost citywide memory of kids of a certain age. And that was probably, what, 2 or 3 generations?
At least.
Yeah, I think it was probably, it evokes a happy memory.
I think that also, well, department stores at one time were like malls in and of themselves. I mean, they had so many departments and they did so many things. And they even provided a lot of things for free, like repairs of all sorts. If you needed to repair your watch, you needed to repair some jewelry, you could get it done for free at the department store. But Kaufmann's in particular marketed itself as an aspirational department store there. And so they're appealing to the top of the market and the bottom of the market in their basement. And they're trying to educate the shoppers about all the good things that they have. And they're showing you with their seal of approval that they're scientifically tested. And you almost get the feeling that they're part of your family. Here, use our department store for your club meeting. Here, use our department store to take college classes. You want to shop high end, take a special elevator to the 11th floor. It only goes up to our boutique that nobody else has. You need bargains? We've got bargains. Go in our basement. We've got candy, we've got books, we've got a travel agency. You need your teensy? We've got dentists. And they try to really take a paternalistic attitude with their employees and give them the best what an employer would give for that time period. They had the Kaufmanns had their own little camp in Fayette County, and they let their employees go there in the summertime for like a nominal fee, get off the train, go stay for the weekend or a week at their cabins. They really were like a family in Pittsburgh, and I think that's what people respond to. Horns was the high end, the carriage trade. They weren't meant for, at least in the beginning, they weren't meant for all shoppers. And they weren't trying to show you the quality. Well, perhaps I'm wrong about this, but it was Kaufmann's that was trying to educate you about goods, educate you and get you to be a more informed shopper.
I think Horns did that too, but definitely to a different segment. They started so much earlier. They started as traditional dry goods store that they were more for the carriage trade. And that people who would be intimidated by Horns were not so intimidated by Kaufmann's.
Right.
I just want to add something. I want to pick up on what Letitia said earlier. She talked about the special experience of going downtown and having a meal at Kaufmann's. At one time, Kaufmann's had 11 restaurants. There was everything from the hot dog stand, which was called standing room only, to the TikTok shop where you got your Mile High ice cream pie, or you could go upstairs to Edgar's and have, a 3-course lunch or dinner. And I think this was in the era before there were so many restaurants in Pittsburgh. We didn't have as much to choose from then as we do now. And so I think a lot of people learned, a lot of generations of Pittsburghers learned what it was to go to a white tablecloth restaurant when they dined either at Kaufmann's or at Horns Tea Room as children or as adolescents. That was certainly my experience growing up in Indianapolis, where the May Company department store was LSR's.
Special treat that mom took you to lunch at the department store. Yeah.
Right.
I do want to add, I feel, of course, now that Kaufmann's is, entirely in the past for us, that now the items that you might have bought there, regardless of whether you still own them or not, have almost taken on the quality of museum artifacts. They now hold these memories for us that I think they're of outsized importance. So I, for instance, remember buying my then boyfriend, who is now my husband, an expensive razor with my Kaufmann's charge. When we were dating, he doesn't have that razor anymore, but that it lives in my memory now because it was such a big purchase to be making for this person that, well, I didn't know if I was going to be with him forever. So I think that now that all those things are in the past, each piece, things that we've bought or that we find in a thrift store or something like that now has become that much more valuable to us because it's now kind of the keeper of these memories. You went shopping before you moved into your college dorm, or you were registering for your wedding, or you had to go there to pick out your first official big, adult clothing, your suit or your dress or your prom gown or what have you. Those things you might not have anymore, but they live on in your memory, and now they're inextricably linked with Kaufmann's because now Kaufmann's is in the past as well. So I think that's another reason that it sort of has this outsized level of importance in there, that there was such an outpouring when the Kaufmann's name went away, first of all, and then when the store itself closed.
They were the last department store downtown, and I think for that reason, it holds a special place in people's hearts.
So did you save your credit card?
I do have my credit card, but you know what was funny? I couldn't find it.
I couldn't find mine either.
So I wanted to put it in the book, and I couldn't find it for the life of me. I finally just bought one off of eBay, and I, blanked out the woman's name that was on it. Wouldn't you know, a couple of months after my book comes out, I found the card.
It was such an experience. I mean, everything is plastic now, but to get the college degree, get the first job, and go down and open the store credit card. And I got mine before there was even MasterCard. I think there was American Express, but that was, for like bigger business people, more grown-up adults. But it was one of the first adulting things that you did was get your store credit card and then go downtown, because downtown had a much greater selection of the work clothes, the official, the official little suit that everybody wore for either the interview suit or the show up at work suit. And there was a much greater collection downtown than there was in the suburban store. So it was like one of the first adulting things that I think a lot of people did. And a lot of women as well as men.
I think too, going into a department store was a very sensory experience. You know, there was color, there was light. If you were on the first floor, they offered you a chance to try perfumes. I can't count the number of times I walked into Kaufmann's on the first floor and a woman would saunter over from the perfume counter and offer me, you know, whatever they were selling that day. It was a very sensory experience. Shopping online, it feels like work to me, and I'm sure it probably feels like work to the rest of you too. So I think that's another reason we miss these places.
Plus, fashion has in so many ways changed. I mean, I was never a big retail shopper anyway, but the choices, yes, there's still fashion at the high end, but it's like the rest of the world, and I think it's worse since COVID, the rest of the world is perfectly happy to be wearing sweatpants. But back at that time, before casual Fridays and just casual everything, people dressed up a lot more, and you had to go, unless you're doing the little dress shop, you were going to the department store. And as I was looking through the pictures, it's like, I joke about a time machine and wanting to shop, but the choice and the quality, it wasn't disposable. It was not made by a person that you don't really want to know about because it's too sad. And then instead of repairing this, I'll just toss it and go buy some other thing or online. It really was an experience.
So we're going to take some questions from the room now. If you have a question, just raise your hand and Evan will come find you with the microphone. While he's making his way, I'm going to read one from Zoom. This is from Kathy White. She said that when we talk about our beautiful Kaufmann's memories, my sister's cousins and I talk about going up the wooden escalator to the mezzanine and the wonderful smells associated with Kaufmann's in that candy shop. Do any of you know why the escalator was wooden? And if you could talk a little bit about the mezzanine and what made it so special, whoever wants to jump in.
I think the escalator was wooden because they never got around to replacing it.
I think it's 1930s.
Yeah, that was, all the escalators were wooden originally, and it would cost a lot of money to replace them. So you start at the bottom, you replace what everybody sees, and the further up you go, the less likely you are to get to it. So that is why they remained wooden.
I think if I recall correctly, there was one of the elevators they had installed in the 1920s had the most capacity at the time in any store. I mean, I don't know how you go about verifying that because obviously, you know, but that was the claim. The claim they made was that their elevator on the first floor could hold, you know, and I would have to have my book in front of me to know the exact number, but you know, it had this outside, and that would have been a wooden elevator as well. Yeah.
So we'll take a question from the room, and before you answer, I'm going to repeat it so the people on Zoom can hear it.
I've always been fascinated by cemeteries. Now, I know that Edgar and Leon and their son are buried in falling water, but I did not know until recent times that the Westview Cemetery, which is at Cemetery Lane and Route 19 out there in Lost Township, actually has 3 of the brothers and their wives buried there. Henry is not, because his wife wanted to go to New York and he's up there somewhere. But it's just so fascinating. They were originally living in Manchester, built homes there, and then they went to Squirrel Hill, but they belonged to Road of Shalom. And having been on a tour there recently, and having been the person that spoke about the Kaufmanns, it was just so fascinating that you can go in there and you can find the 3 of them fairly close together.
So for the people online, the comment was that it's well known that Edgar and Lillian are buried at Falling Water, but that 3 of the brothers are buried at Westview Cemetery, which is the Road of Shalom Congregation Cemetery up in the North Hills. So if anybody has anything they'd like to add to that.
I would just like to comment that there is a home on the north side of Pittsburgh in a neighborhood called Allegheny West. And there's a street through Allegheny West called Brighton Road. And in the 900 block of Brighton Road is a house where Jacob Kaufmann and his family lived for about 12 years, from about 1890 to 1902. And it wasn't a house that was built by Jacob Kaufmann, but he lived there with his wife, his 5 children, and a nephew whom he adopted, and they enlarged the house. And we recently had the opportunity, the privilege of touring the house. The couple who own it have lavished a lot of time and attention in restoring it. And it's really a beautiful Gilded Age house. So there is, a house here locally that is of interest and has been on the Allegheny West house tour in the past.
I think, like to add, well, that's very true, and we're indebted to the family, the Malikoffs, for allowing us to see the house. Also, if you go into Rodef Shalom and you are standing in the area where the congregation would sit, and you look directly up at the organ, there is a dedication to Irene Kaufmann engraved on the organ.
We have another question from the room.
Remember a restaurant called the Bahama Mamas. Was that in Kaufmann? Something like that.
So the question is whether the restaurant Bahama Mamas is in Kaufmann's.
I don't have any recollection of that. My recollection is that that restaurant was, it was downtown, but I thought it was on 4th Avenue. That's my recollection anyway. I could be wrong. Restaurants come and go.
This is a question from Elizabeth Cohen online. She says that obviously the suburban malls took some business away from the downtown stores, but she wants to know if there's any relationship between neighborhood commercial districts like Walnut Street or Forbes Avenue and the decline of downtown, or if those were more complementary, or if they had nothing to do with each other.
Wow.
It's an interesting question.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. From what I remember, the shopping destinations like Shady Side and Walnut Street had independent shops. It was kind of, you could walk like you could for a mall, but it was kind of the anti-mall. But Kaufmann's, when they went out to the suburbs, and that was the big move, post-World War II, when a lot of the people who shopped in the stores moved to suburbia. Parking was an issue. They built the highway system where people could actually relocate to suburbia but work downtown. So you ended up with that whole entire suburban system. And Kaufmann's, I think, was one of the first of the Pittsburgh department stores that moved out to the suburbs. And I think the only store they put in the mall was actually in Monroeville, but the North Hills and the South Hills stores, Kaufmann's built a freestanding Kaufmann store. So the Kaufmann's in the North Hills was on McKnight Road, but it was kind of catty corner from one of the earliest malls out there, Northway. Like the Northway Mall was one of the first of the suburban malls in the North Hills. Horns was in Northway Mall, and Gimbel's had a store in one of the malls farther down McKnight, but Kaufmann's was always a standalone Kaufmann store with its own parking.
I think actually that original North Hills Kaufmann's is now the Macy's Furniture.
It may be, it's gone
So
through a
it's,
lot of.
yeah, I wouldn't, so it's across the road from Northway.
Yes.
It's not catty corner to it, but it's still in that Ross Park Mall complex. It's just that separate building that's now Macy's
I think
Furniture.
it was a Giant Eagle at one point, and then there was somebody like a sports store maybe downstairs. It had 2 levels. It was an upper level that you could enter from a back parking lot and a lower level that you can enter. And then each of the levels became separate entities.
I just want to say, I don't really think that the expansion into the suburbs really hurt the flagship store all that much, because there was still so much commerce downtown. There was, people had to be there for work. And the whole Kaufman's shopping on your lunch break was a real thing. I know my mom was working at US Steel in the 70s, and that was what she did on her lunch break. She was over there shopping. So I don't think it had any immediate impact. I think it was a long-term thing, and it was a combination of factors, that it was the gradual loss of businesses downtown, and that led to the decline of the retail. And so it kind of became a vicious cycle of losing a lot of the business and the retail.
And even in the stores in suburbia were much smaller than the flagship, and there were specific things that you could not get in suburbia. Now, the suburban store might ask that it be sent out from the city, but there were entire things like, I think rugs, and the Von Dome never came to the suburbs.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the Kaufmann's tried very hard to maintain the downtown store as the flagship where you want to go. They wanted you to come downtown, and they were slow to move out to the suburbs. They dragged their feet. Horns was the first one.
I think Horns was the first to Mount Lebanon.
And when they did move out, they saw themselves as malls. So they just opened these standalone stores, and they were like, well, you can come here. You don't need a mall. We are the mall. You come to us. Eventually they moved into the malls when Gimbel's closed 3 of their stores. Kaufmann's moved into those 3. Did the malls eat into the profits downtown and have anything to do with? They did eat it because so many people moved out of the city after World War II into the suburbs where it was perceived, where it was cleaner and you got more land. You didn't have to live in the crowded, dirty city. And the parking was free. Parking was always a huge problem for Kaufmann's. They never did figure out a good answer to that. Did Kaufmann's eat into the profits of the little boutiques in these little shopping areas? Yes. They were able to get deals for their, they could buy in bulk that the little stores couldn't, and the little stores were not happy about that. Later on, Kaufmann's would be upset, the department stores would be upset because the big box stores could get even better deals. I don't know if that answers the question.
Well, and I think that was actually the beginning, which is what's so ironic about that picture of Target in the Kaufmann's was that, and I think it probably started back in the 60s and started slowly, but the big box stores were pretty much one of the biggest challenges to the department stores.
Well, what I think is even more ironic is that Target itself used to be one of the big traditional department stores called Dayton's that started in Minnesota. Then they became Target. Then they're a big box store. Now they're in the flagship store of our beloved department store. So it's kind of just come very weirdly full circle.
The one thing I wanted to say in response to the question was, I think the question was talking about Forbes Avenue and Walnut Street in Shadyside. When I moved to Pittsburgh in 1980, Walnut Street was a collection of restaurants, bars, and distinctive shops. There was the William Penn hat and gown shop. There was Coons and Ryder. There were Cards Unlimited, which is still there, unlike the other 2 stores. So, and then of course, you had sort of the malling of Walnut Street with the big chains like Victoria's Secret and J. Crew and Talbot's and so on. And I think that's when Walnut Street sort of ceased to be as much of a destination as it had been. As for the Forbes Avenue Business District in Squirrel Hill, I think the big impact on that area was the opening of the waterfront mall in Homestead on the site of the former steel mill. So I think that was what was hard for the Squirrel Hill Business District, although it still seems to be alive and well.
Well, I want to thank you all for coming out today. I want to thank our 4 authors, Marilyn Pitts, Laura Malt Schneiderman, Melanie Lim-Gutowski, and Letitia Savage. And I want to thank all the people behind the scenes. These hybrid programs take a lot of people and you don't always see all of them. But I want to thank all of them. And I want to thank all of you for coming out to an in-person program. Hopefully the world will allow us to keep having these over the coming year and years. And I believe the authors are, if you can grab them before they get to the door, you can ask those questions directly. So thank you all for coming.